This is Brooks at Big Crunch Amp Repair. Today on the bench we have a very interesting amp. It's a Sound model X305R. It's a pretty rare amp. If you want to look up some details on this thing, it's unusual. There's some cool things about it, like you can select to have reverb on channel 1 or channel 2 or both, which is pretty unique. It has this fantastic blue jewel for the pilot lamp. Has two channels that seem to be identical. Both channels have volume, bass, and treble. It also has tremolo with a speed and a depth control. The power is on the front, controlled by a knob, which is cool. Polarity also is a knob. Here inside we see some of the original filter caps. Those need to be replaced. There's a can cap down here that needs to be replaced. We'll also be replacing this two-prong power cable. And it has a few other issues we're going to work on, but that's just an introduction for now. Okay, phase 1 is complete on our X305R amplifier. I installed new filter capacitors here, and here. The original can cap I still left physically in the chassis because number one, they're difficult to remove sometimes. Number two, if you look at it from the outside, it still has an original appearance, and it doesn't do any harm staying here as long as it's not connected. So I actually split out that can cap into three individual single capacitors. One's over here. These are very nice Kendrick brand filter caps, electrolytic caps. I also replaced the smaller electrolytics here that serve as the bypass capacitors on the cathodes of the preamp tubes. And so that's the end of phase 1. I'll have another update soon. The next issue with the X305R was that the reverb was not working. There was no reverb sound on any channel at any setting, even with the depth all the way up. So the first thing I always look to see is signal getting out of the amp to the tank. And so here's our reverb transformer here. And I did do a signal trace and found that here is the reverb send jack, and I was getting sound out of that. The next thing I check is to see if I insert a signal into the return jack, if then it's amplified onto the rest of the amp, and it was. So if the send and the return are working, then I always look at the tank next. Here is the original tank that I pulled out of the cabinet, and what I found is this wire here, which was actually a different wire. I replaced it. That wire had broken off of the connection to the transducer here. It had actually been replaced before. It was a big, thick, not very pliable wire, which is bad inside a reverb tank that needs to bounce and move. So I replaced that wire with a much smaller and much bendier wire. And I hooked the tank up, and now we have a functional reverb circuit. So that wasn't too bad of a fix. And I like that we can keep the original tank and don't have to replace it. And so now the R in X305R is now working. I just completed the next step on this Sound X305R, which was a modification request by the customer. As I said earlier, this amp has 2 channels which are both identical. So the customer requested changing the value of the capacitors in the tone stack to give a different voicing to channel 1 from channel 2. So here we see on the board, these are the original caps for channel 1. These values here are a little strange. It's a 0.1 microfarad, a 0.039, and then the treble cap is a 380 picofarad here. So for the second channel, I changed these to more traditional sort of Marshall values of 2.022 microfarads and then a 470 picofarad for the treble cap. Also, another modification I added was a bypass capacitor here on this, across this cathode resistor to give that section more gain. Also, while we're looking at the chassis from this direction, one thing I think is pretty cool about this amp is that the turret boards are actually mounted on these sort of about 3/4 by 3/4 inch just blocks of wood that these component boards are screwed directly to. I don't know, I think that's pretty cool. And so on to the next step. Okay, here is the next modification that was requested by the customer. And by the way, all the mods to this amp were actually found in an article on PremierGuitar.com, an article written by Jeff Bober. And if you're into tube amplifiers and you don't know who Jeff Bober is, you definitely should look him up. Anyways, so these caps here are part of the tremolo circuit, and this amp, but the stock values, has a pretty good sounding tremolo, but even at the lowest setting, the trim speed is still pretty rapid. So adding more capacitance here into the oscillation circuit, you can actually slow down that trim. So again, that was a customer requested modification that was found in an article written by Jeff Bober on PremierGuitar.com. So I'm anxious to actually hear the difference now that these caps are installed. Okay, so here is the amp on the bench powered on. Look at that beautiful blue jewel there. I am running a 1K sine wave into channel 1. I've got the amp hooked up to a 8 ohm dummy load, and I'm going to monitor the output on my oscilloscope, and I'm doing this to check the output power of the amp. I have already set the bias of the output tubes. Here's the bias adjust trim pot right here. Another thing I didn't show in earlier videos, this capacitor here and this capacitor here are the filter caps for the bias, the negative voltage bias supply. So let's see what we get here. So I'm turning up the volume on channel 1, and here's our sine wave, and we're peaking out about right there. So we see that's 13.5.4 AC volts across our dummy load. That translates to about 22 watts of output power, which is what I would expect from this amplifier. So everything looks really good. We have a nice symmetrical sine wave. Let's see what happens when we push it a little bit into saturation. We have a pretty symmetrical saturation on the positive and minus side. There's a little bit of, you can see in here, a little bit of crossover distortion. That's sort of normal on this type of amp. When you really push it, you definitely don't see it when it's in the clean sine wave setting. These are the output tubes of the amp. They're a little unusual for guitar amplifiers. They're 7868 output tubes. And as we just saw, we're getting about 22 clean watts out of the pair, which is what I would expect. Okay, here is the X305R in its final stages. I've put the head back in the original cabinet, you can see here. We're going to look around the back. You see that the original speaker was a single 15-inch there in the cabinet, which is pretty cool. You see the reverb tank here hanging upside down. These jacks here on the back are actually for foot switch control of the reverb and the tremolo. And we have our new 3-prong modern power cable. Okay, now it's time to see how this Sound Model X305R sounds after we've put it all together, done the modifications, repaired what needs to be repaired. One thing I didn't mention is here, I actually rewired the ground polarity switch to be a standby switch, which it originally didn't have. I also moved the knob from the tremolo control over to the standby switch so that we'd have something to grab onto and it would match the power control. There's that blue jewel that I love, so let's see what this thing sounds like. So first we're going to plug into channel 1. Take it off standby. Dial in a little bit of reverb. So now the speed is much more usable than it originally was. Now let's check out the second channel, which has been modified with different values in the tone section. And you'll see it has a lot more drive to it. So overall, I'm pretty happy with the way everything turned out on this. I think it sounds great. It's a very usable amp. And that's all for now.